Why didn't you tell me? Jungkook's voice cracked as he stared at Jimin, his hands trembling so hard that even Suga instinctively stepped forward. You met my mother more than once, and everyone kept it from me. Jimin lowered his eyes, unable to answer immediately. The silence hurt more than any explanation. Suga finally spoke in a calm but heavy voice. Because your mother begged us not to. Jungkook's breathing became uneven. What could possibly make my own mother ask you to hide something from me? Jimin slowly reached into his coat pocket and held a small, worn envelope that had clearly been opened many times before. His fingers shook as if simply touching it brought back unbearable memories. No one backstage dared to interrupt. The room was filled only with the distant echo of a cheering stadium outside. Then the narrator asked quietly, what kind of truth could make a mother secretly meet Jimin, yet leave her own son completely unaware until this very moment? And if you were Jungkook, would you forgive them for keeping such a secret, or would you feel betrayed? Tell us what you truly think before this story unfolds. The atmosphere inside Jungkook's family home felt unusually heavy despite the warm yellow lights illuminating every corner of the modest living room. A quiet rain tapped gently against the windows, wrapping the house in a peaceful silence that sharply contrasted with the storm of emotions filling the room. The scent of freshly brewed tea lingered in the air, untouched on the wooden coffee table between them. Family photographs lined the walls, capturing years of ordinary happiness, childhood birthdays, school graduations, and faded vacation memories. One particular photograph of a young Jungkook smiling beside his mother caught Jimin's attention, and he unconsciously lowered his gaze. Suga remained seated beside him, quietly observing every subtle movement without saying a word. Across from them, Jungkook's mother folded her hands tightly on her lap. Her gentle smile tried to hide the exhaustion in her eyes, but the faint tremble in her breathing revealed a burden she had carried alone for far too long. Jungkook stood near the doorway, unable to bring himself any closer. The envelope still rested in Jimin's hands, unopened since it had been placed back inside after countless moments of hesitation. Nobody rushed the conversation. Even the ticking clock mounted on the wall seemed louder than usual. Jimin finally broke the silence with a soft voice. I never wanted this secret to come between you and your mother. Jungkook slowly looked at him, confusion mixing with hurt. Then why did you keep coming here without telling me? Before Jimin could answer, Suga quietly leaned forward, his expression calm yet filled with empathy. Because every visit wasn't about hiding something from you. It was about protecting something your mother believed you weren't ready to carry. Jungkook frowned, unable to understand. His mother gently reached for the teacup before her but stopped halfway, her fingers trembling. She withdrew her hand and instead looked toward the rain-covered window, gathering the courage she had postponed for months. There are moments, she whispered, when a parent chooses silence not because they don't trust their child, but because they love them too deeply to let them carry another person's pain. Those words settled heavily over the room. Jimin remembered the first afternoon he had quietly knocked on this very door months earlier after receiving an unexpected phone call from Jungkook's mother. She had never asked for money, publicity, or favors connected to BTS. Instead, she had asked for something far more difficult, a promise. A promise that forced Jimin to choose between honesty and compassion. From that day forward, every secret visit to this quiet home carried the weight of that promise, while Suga became the only member who knew the entire truth and silently stood beside Jimin, determined that no one, not even the other BTS members, would learn the reason until the time was right. Jungkook searched every face in the room, hoping someone would finally give him a simple answer, but the silence that followed only deepened his unease. His mother inhaled slowly before standing from the sofa and walking toward a small wooden cabinet beneath the family photographs. She opened the lowest drawer with careful hands and removed an old leather notebook whose edges had become worn with time. She held it against her chest for a long moment before placing it gently on the coffee table between them. This, she said softly, is the reason I asked Jimin to come. Jungkook looked at the notebook, puzzled. It seemed ordinary, yet the way his mother handled it made it feel priceless. Jimin's eyes remained fixed on the cover, remembering the countless evenings he had sat in the same living room listening more than speaking. Suga quietly watched Jungkook, knowing the younger member was only beginning to understand how much had been hidden from him. Jungkook carefully opened the notebook. Instead of financial records or medical reports, every page was filled with handwritten names, dates, and short stories. There were photographs tucked between the pages, children smiling in hospital rooms, elderly couples standing outside modest homes, struggling musicians holding borrowed instruments, and families whose faces reflected both hardship and hope. Confused, Jungkook looked up. Who are these people? His mother smiled faintly, though tears shimmered in her eyes. People whose lives crossed mine over many years. Some lost family, some lost hope, some simply needed someone willing to listen. Jimin quietly added, "Your mother never wanted recognition. She only wanted to make sure they were never forgotten." Jungkook turned another page and discovered small envelopes attached beside many of the names. Each envelope contained letters of gratitude, children's drawings, or photographs sent years later showing lives that had slowly improved. The room fell silent again as he realized his mother had quietly dedicated much of her life to helping complete strangers without ever mentioning it to anyone, including him. "Why didn't I know any of this?" Jungkook whispered. His mother lowered her head. "Because every time you came home, you were exhausted. You were chasing your dreams, carrying responsibilities that no young man should have to carry alone. I wanted this house to remain the one place where you could simply be my son, not someone burdened by my choices." Jungkook's chest tightened with guilt. Memories flashed through his mind, missed family dinners, rushed phone calls between rehearsals, promises to visit that became delayed by tour and recordings. None of those moments had been intentional, yet together they formed a distance he had never truly noticed. Jimin leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "She never blamed you, not once." Suga nodded in agreement. "Every time we came here, she asked about your health before anything else. She worried about whether you were sleeping enough, eating properly, smiling sincerely. Even when she was helping others, your name was always the first one she mentioned." Jungkook closed the notebook slowly, fighting back emotions he could no longer contain. For the first time, he realized that the greatest struggle hidden inside this house had never been illness, loneliness, or sacrifice alone. It was the quiet decision of a mother to protect her son's heart, while carrying the emotional weight of countless other lives by herself. And Jimin and Suga had become the guardians of that promise, without ever expecting gratitude in return. The rain outside grew heavier, creating a steady rhythm against the glass as the room slowly filled with emotions that nobody could easily express. Jungkook remained seated, holding the old notebook in both hands, but his eyes were no longer focused on the pages. He was somewhere between memories of the past and the painful realization of everything he had failed to notice. The young man who had spent years performing in front of millions of people suddenly felt powerless in a quiet living room where only a few people knew the truth. "How long?" Jungkook finally asked, his voice softer than before. He looked at Jimin. "How long have you been coming here?" Jimin hesitated. He glanced briefly toward Jungkook's mother, silently asking for permission before answering. She gave a small nod. "Almost a year," Jimin replied. Jungkook lowered his head. "Almost a year." A year of conversations, struggles, and moments he had never known existed. "And you never told me." There was no anger in his voice anymore, only disappointment and confusion. Jimin slowly shook his head. "I wanted to, many times, but every time I thought about telling you, I remembered what your mother said." "What did she say?" Jungkook asked. Jimin looked at the notebook on the table before answering. "She said, please don't let my worries become another responsibility on his shoulders. He already carries enough." Those words hit Jungkook harder than he expected. Across the room, Suga remained quiet because he understood something about Jungkook that others often missed. Behind the confidence, behind the stage presence, there was someone who always felt responsible for protecting the people around him. If he had discovered his mother's struggles earlier, he would have tried to fix everything himself, even if it meant forgetting his own exhaustion. That was exactly what his mother had wanted to prevent. The conversation continued as the night became deeper. Jimin explained how he first received the unexpected message from Jungkook's mother after seeing a small news article about one of the families she had helped. She had not contacted him because he was famous. She contacted him because she knew Jimin was someone who understood quiet struggles. She remembered how he often noticed the people standing at the edge of a room, the staff member working late, the backup dancer hiding an injury, the fan trying to smile while fighting personal battles. "She told me something I'll never forget," Jimin said. "She said kindness doesn't always need to be loud. Sometimes the most meaningful things happen when nobody knows they happened." Jungkook looked toward his mother, realizing that her entire life reflected those words, but the truth was still incomplete. There was something else behind the visits, something Jimin and Suga had not yet explained. A reason why his mother had specifically asked Jimin to keep coming back, even when she knew the secret could eventually hurt Jungkook. At that moment, a phone on the table suddenly vibrated. Everyone looked toward it. It was a message from RM asking if everything was okay, followed by messages from Jin, J-Hope, and V, who had noticed something was wrong after Jungkook suddenly disappeared from their schedule. The secret that had remained inside this house for months was beginning to reach beyond its walls. Jimin looked at Suga, and Suga immediately understood. The time they had been trying to delay was approaching, because there was one final truth in that notebook, a truth about a moment when Jungkook's mother needed help, not for herself, but for someone connected to Jungkook's own dream. And when Jungkook discovered who that person was, he would finally understand why Jimin had chosen silence instead of honesty. The room remained silent for several seconds after Jimin finished speaking. The sound of the rain outside seemed distant now, as if even the world beyond the walls had paused to allow Jungkook time to process everything he had heard. He stared at the notebook in front of him, turning the pages slowly, carefully, almost afraid that another hidden truth might appear. Every photograph, every handwritten message, every name written inside represented a person his mother had helped without expecting anything in return. Yet somehow, the person who had always been there for everyone else had never allowed herself to ask for help. Jungkook's fingers stopped on one particular page. Unlike the others, this page contained only a single sentence written in his mother's handwriting. "Some people spend their lives searching for someone who believes in them. Sometimes all they need is one person who refuses to give up." Jungkook read the sentence several times, feeling something inside him shift. "Who is this about?" he asked quietly. His mother looked away. That small movement was enough for Jungkook to realize there was still something being hidden. Jimin and Suga exchanged a brief glance. They both knew this was the moment they had been avoiding. Suga leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. He had always been someone who understood the power of silence. Sometimes silence protected people. Sometimes silence only delayed a necessary conversation. And tonight, there was no longer a reason to delay. "Jungkook," Suga said gently, "before you hear the rest, I want you to understand one thing. Nobody here was trying to deceive you." Jungkook looked at him. "Then why does it feel like everyone knew something about my life except me?" Suga accepted the question without defending himself. "Because sometimes the people who love us make decisions based on what they think will protect us. But that doesn't mean those decisions are always easy to accept." Jimin lowered his head. He knew that better than anyone. For months, he had carried the uncomfortable feeling of knowing something important about Jungkook's family while pretending everything was normal during rehearsals, recordings, and performances. He remembered standing beside Jungkook on stage, laughing together under thousands of lights, while silently carrying the knowledge that Jungkook's mother was fighting a private emotional battle at home. It had never been easy. The first time Jimin visited the house, he had expected a simple conversation. Instead, he found a woman sitting alone at a dining table surrounded by unopened letters from people she had helped over the years. She had looked tired, but her first question was not about herself. It was about Jungkook. "Is he eating well?" she had asked. "Is he sleeping enough? Does he still laugh when the cameras are gone?" Those questions stayed with Jimin because they revealed something powerful. Even while carrying her own worries, she was still thinking about her son. Back in the living room, Jungkook finally looked at Jimin directly. Why did you agree? He asked. You could have told me. You could have said my mother needed me. Jimin took a slow breath before answering. Because I saw the way you looked at your members when they were struggling. I knew you would immediately forget yourself and try to carry everything. Jungkook stayed quiet. He knew Jimin was right. Countless times he had rushed to help others before admitting when he himself was tired. Jimin continued, Your mother wasn't asking me to replace you. She wasn't asking me to keep you away from her life. She was asking me to give her time to prepare herself to talk to you. The words changed something in the room. This was not a story about a mother hiding pain from her child. It was about a mother trying to find the courage to show vulnerability to the person she loved most. Suddenly, the front door opened quietly. The familiar voices of RM, Jin, J-Hope, and V could be heard from the hallway. They had decided to come after realizing Jungkook had not answered their messages. They entered slowly, immediately sensing the emotional atmosphere. Nobody asked unnecessary questions. They simply stood there, offering silent support. Jin looked at Jungkook and gave a small, understanding smile. J-Hope placed a hand gently on Jungkook's shoulder. V looked around the room, noticing the notebook and the tears that Jungkook was trying to hide. RM quietly said, Sometimes we spend so much time protecting each other that we forget we also need to let others protect us. Those words carried through the room. Jungkook looked at the members who had shared years of struggle, success, uncertainty, and growth with him. He realized that family was not only connected by blood. Sometimes family was the person who sat beside you when you were unable to explain what you were feeling. Jimin reached for the final page of the notebook and carefully opened it. Inside was a photograph that had never been shown publicly. It was a picture of a young musician playing in a nearly empty room, surrounded by broken equipment and unfinished songs. Beneath it was a handwritten note. Everyone deserves one person who says, Your dream is still worth fighting for. Jungkook looked at the photograph, confused at first. Then his expression slowly changed. He recognized the person in the image. His eyes widened and his voice became almost a whisper. No, this can't be. Jimin watched him carefully. Suga closed his eyes for a moment, knowing the truth was finally arriving. The person Jungkook's mother had secretly helped was not a stranger. It was someone connected to a memory Jungkook had buried years ago, someone whose story would reveal a side of his mother's love that even he had never seen before. And for the first time that night, Jungkook understood that the secret was never meant to separate him from the people he loved. It was a reminder that sometimes the strongest love exists in the sacrifices nobody sees. The photograph remained between Jungkook's fingers as the entire room waited. Nobody moved. Nobody wanted to interrupt the emotion that was slowly rising inside him. The image was old, slightly faded around the edges, but the person in it was unmistakable. A young musician sitting alone in a small practice room, surrounded by cables, unfinished compositions, and a dream that seemed impossible at the time. Jungkook remembered that room. He remembered the sound of those unfinished melodies. He remembered the person who had once told him that talent meant nothing if someone stopped believing in themselves. But he never knew what happened after that night. He never knew someone had quietly stepped in when that person was ready to give up. How did she? Jungkook stopped, unable to complete the sentence. His mother looked at him with a mixture of sadness and warmth, because she saw what you saw. Jungkook looked confused. What do you mean? His mother gently touched the notebook. You were the first person who believed in him. The room became even quieter. Jimin watched Jungkook's expression change as memories began returning. Years earlier, before fame reached every corner of their lives, before stadiums and worldwide recognition, there had been countless nights when dreams felt fragile. There were people around them who struggled silently, people who questioned whether they were good enough, people who almost walked away before seeing the future they had worked so hard for. Jungkook had always remembered the moments when others supported him, but he rarely remembered the times when he had unknowingly become someone else's reason to continue. Your mother told me something during my first visit, Jimin said softly. She said you always believed you were the youngest member who needed protection, but she saw something different. Jungkook looked toward him. She saw someone who had spent his whole life giving hope to others without realizing it. Those words affected him deeply, because somewhere along the journey, Jungkook had become so focused on improving himself that he forgot the impact of simple actions. A few encouraging words, a phone call, a moment of listening. Small things that seemed meaningless to him had become unforgettable moments for someone else. Suga, who had been silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke. "That's why your mother didn't want you to know immediately." Jungkook looked at him. "Why?" Suga answered carefully. "Because she knew you would blame yourself." The truth of that statement hit him instantly. If he had known someone was struggling, he would have wondered why he wasn't there. He would have questioned every missed opportunity, every unanswered message, every moment he was busy chasing schedules. But his mother knew her son. She knew he carried responsibility too easily. Jungkook slowly placed the photograph back on the table. "I thought she was hiding something from me because she didn't trust me." His voice became quieter, but she was actually trying to protect me from myself. His mother reached across the table and held his hand. The gesture was simple, but it carried years of emotions that words could not express. "You have always wanted to save everyone," she whispered, "but my biggest wish was for you to understand that you are also someone worth protecting." Jungkook looked down, trying to control his emotions. For years, he had stood under bright lights with millions of eyes watching him. He had performed through exhaustion, smiled through difficult moments, and reassured fans that everything was okay. Yet sitting in that small living room surrounded by the people closest to him, he realized how rarely he allowed himself to simply be vulnerable. Jimin quietly stood and walked toward the bookshelf near the window. He picked up a small wooden box that had been placed there. "There is one more thing your mother wanted you to see." Jungkook looked at him. "Another secret." Jimin gave a small, emotional smile. "Not a secret, a memory." Inside the box were dozens of handwritten letters. Some were old. Some were recent. Some had faded ink from years ago. Jungkook carefully opened the first one. It was a letter from a young performer who had once been ready to abandon music completely. The letter thanked his mother for believing in him when nobody else did. Another letter came from a family who said her kindness helped them survive the most difficult period of their lives. But then Jungkook found a letter with his own name written on the front. His hands froze. "Why is this here?" he asked. His mother looked surprised for a moment, then realized which letter he had found. "I wrote that years ago," she said, "but I never gave it to you." Jungkook slowly opened it. The handwriting was familiar. It was the handwriting he had seen throughout his entire life. The first sentence immediately made his eyes fill with tears. "My son, if one day you feel like you are not enough, remember that your worth was never measured by how many people know your name. It was always measured by how many hearts you touched without realizing it." Nobody spoke while Jungkook read. Even the members standing nearby looked away for a moment, giving him privacy during the emotional weight of those words. Suga turned toward the window, hiding his own reaction. He understood that some moments were not meant to be interrupted, even by people who cared deeply. After several minutes, Jungkook folded the letter carefully and pressed it against his chest. He finally looked at Jimin. "You carried this all this time," Jimin nodded, "because I promised your mother I would give it to you when you were ready." Jungkook stood slowly and walked toward Jimin. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Jungkook pulled him into a quiet embrace. It was not the kind of dramatic moment people expected from someone standing in front of millions of fans. It was much smaller, much more human. A simple hug between two friends who had spent years supporting each other through moments the world never saw. "I'm sorry," Jungkook whispered. Jimin immediately shook his head. "Don't apologize. But I should have known." "No," Jimin replied gently. "You should know now, that's what matters." Across the room, Suga watched them with a small smile. He knew this was the moment everything changed. The secret that had once felt like a heavy burden was becoming something different. A reminder that love was not always shown through grand gestures. Sometimes it appeared in quiet visits, unanswered questions, and promises kept behind closed doors. But the night was not over yet, because one final conversation remained. The conversation between Jungkook and his mother, the one they had both avoided for months. And when they finally faced each other alone, The words they had been holding back would reveal the deepest wound and the greatest healing of all. The house slowly became quieter as the night continued. One by one, the members moved away from the living room, giving Jungkook and his mother the space they both needed. RM gently guided the others toward the kitchen, while Jin prepared fresh tea without saying much. J-Hope looked back once before leaving the room, his expression showing the same concern he had carried since entering the house. V quietly closed the door, understanding that some conversations could only happen between two people. For the first time that night, Jungkook and his mother were alone. The rain outside had softened into a gentle drizzle, and the warm light from the lamp beside the sofa created a peaceful atmosphere. Yet inside Jungkook's heart, there was still a storm of emotions he had not released. He sat across from his mother, the old notebook still resting between them. For years, he had been known as someone who could stand confidently in front of thousands of people, but now he struggled to find the right words in front of the one person who had known him before the world knew his name. "Why didn't you tell me you were carrying all of this?" Jungkook finally asked. His voice was calm, but the pain behind it was impossible to hide. His mother looked down at her hands. "Because I was afraid." Jungkook looked surprised. He had expected many answers, but not that one. "Afraid of what?" She took a deep breath. "Afraid that you would stop living your own life because you were trying to take care of mine." The answer immediately changed the way he saw everything. His mother continued slowly, choosing every word carefully. "Since you were young, you have always been like this. When someone around you was sad, you noticed. When someone needed help, you moved first. Even as a child, you would give away things you loved if you thought someone else needed them more." A small smile appeared on her face through the sadness. "I was proud of that, but I also worried that one day you would forget that you were allowed to be tired." Jungkook lowered his head. Those words felt painfully accurate. He remembered countless moments when he hid his exhaustion because he didn't want his family or members to worry. He remembered answering calls with a smile even when he barely had energy left. He remembered telling everyone he was fine because that was easier than explaining how difficult some days could be. "I thought being strong meant never showing weakness," Jungkook admitted. His mother shook her head gently. "No, being strong means knowing when you need someone beside you." The simplicity of that sentence broke the wall he had built for years. His eyes became red as he looked away, trying to hold back tears. But this time, he didn't force himself to hide them. "I feel like I missed so many moments," he whispered. "I should have been here, I should have noticed." His mother immediately reached for his hand. "Listen to me carefully, you did not fail me." Her voice became firmer. "You gave me something more valuable than anything else. You gave me a reason to be proud every single day." Jungkook looked at her. "But I wasn't there." "You were," she replied. "Maybe not sitting in this room every day, maybe not knowing every detail. But every time I watched you on stage, every time I saw how you treated people around you, I knew the person I raised was still there." The words left Jungkook speechless. In that moment, he realized his mother had never measured love by distance. She had never counted missed dinners or delayed visits. She had measured love through the person he continued becoming. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Jimin and Suga quietly listened from a distance, not trying to hear the conversation but unable to ignore the emotional atmosphere surrounding the home. Suga leaned against the counter, looking at the cup of tea in his hands. "She really is amazing," he said quietly. Jimin nodded. "She reminds me that some people spend their entire lives giving love without expecting anyone to notice." Suga looked toward the living room. And Jungkook needed to know that someone was doing the same for him. Jimin smiled faintly. "Maybe we all need to know that sometimes." Back in the living room, Jungkook opened his heart in a way he rarely did. He told his mother about the pressure he had carried, the fear of disappointing people, and the loneliness that sometimes appeared even when surrounded by millions of supporters. He admitted that there were moments when he wondered whether he was doing enough, whether he was becoming the person everyone expected him to be. His mother listened without interrupting. She did not try to immediately solve his problems. She simply listened. And for Jungkook, that was exactly what he needed. "You know what hurts the most?" Jungkook said after a long silence. "I spent so much time worrying that I wasn't doing enough for everyone." But I never realized there were people who were quietly doing everything they could for me. His mother squeezed his hand. That's because love is often like that. The person giving it doesn't always realize how much it means, and the person receiving it doesn't always notice until much later. A few minutes later, Jimin entered the room holding the final item from the wooden box. It was a small bracelet made from simple threads, nothing expensive or extraordinary. Jungkook looked at it curiously. "What is this?" Jimin smiled. "Your mother made it years ago." His mother looked slightly embarrassed. "It was nothing special." "It was special," Jimin said, "because you made it with a reason." Jungkook turned the bracelet over and noticed a small phrase stitched into the inside, 4 simple words: "Keep going forward." His eyes filled again. It was the same phrase his mother used to say whenever he doubted himself as a trainee. A phrase he had forgotten over time but somehow carried with him throughout his journey. He gently placed the bracelet around his wrist. It was not a symbol of fame, success, or achievement. It was a reminder of the person he was before the world was watching. At that moment, the other members slowly returned to the living room. Nobody spoke immediately. They simply stood together, sharing the quietness of the moment. RM looked at Jungkook and smiled. Jin placed a hand on his shoulder. J-Hope laughed softly through his emotions, trying to lighten the atmosphere. V smiled and said, "Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who finally allow themselves to cry." Everyone smiled, even through tears. Jimin looked at Suga and they both understood that the purpose of their visits had finally been fulfilled. The secret was no longer a burden. It had become a bridge between a son and a mother, between friends. Between people who had spent years giving everything to others but finally learned they were also allowed to receive love. Outside the house, the rain stopped completely. The clouds slowly separated, revealing a quiet night sky above the neighborhood. Nobody outside knew what had happened inside that small living room. There were no cameras, no headlines, no audience watching, only a family sharing an honest moment. And perhaps that was why it mattered so much. Because the most meaningful moments in life are often the ones that happen when nobody is watching. The morning after that emotional night arrived quietly. Soft sunlight entered through the windows of the house, replacing the darkness and rain that had surrounded them only hours before. The living room looked almost exactly the same as it had the previous evening. The same wooden table, the same family photographs on the wall, the same old sofa where countless conversations had happened. But something inside the room had changed. The weight that had once filled the space was no longer there. The notebook that had carried so many hidden stories was now placed openly on the table, no longer something that needed to be protected or hidden. It had become a reminder of connection rather than a symbol of secrecy. Jungkook woke up earlier than everyone else. He stood quietly in front of the family photographs, looking at years of memories that he had passed by so many times without truly stopping to appreciate. He saw himself as a child holding his mother's hand. Saw moments before fame changed their lives. He saw a version of himself who had no idea what the future would bring. For the first time in a long time, he didn't look at those pictures with regret. He looked at them with gratitude. His mother entered the room carrying 2 cups of coffee. She smiled when she saw him standing there. "You always wake up early when you have something on your mind," she said. Jungkook smiled slightly. "You still know me too well." She handed him the cup and sat beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply enjoyed the peaceful silence. Sometimes healing did not come from dramatic apologies or perfect words. Sometimes it came from being able to sit beside someone again without feeling the need to explain everything. "I want to help," Jungkook finally said. His mother looked at him carefully. "Help with what?" "With the people you helped. With the things you carried alone." She smiled softly, but this time she did not immediately accept his offer. "Only if you remember one thing." Jungkook looked at her. "What?" "You are not helping because you feel guilty. You are helping because you care." Those words stayed with him. He understood that there was a difference between carrying someone's burden and walking beside them. For years, he thought love meant taking away every difficulty from the people around him. Now he realized sometimes love meant simply standing beside someone and reminding them they were not alone. Later that morning, Jimin and Suga prepared to leave. The atmosphere was completely different from when they first arrived. The tension had disappeared, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. Jungkook walked them to the door. For a few seconds he just looked at Jimin, remembering all the emotions from the night before. "I still don't know whether I should be angry at you or thank you," Jungkook said with a small smile. Jimin laughed softly. "You can do both." Jungkook nodded. "Maybe I will." Then his expression became serious. "But thank you for being there for her." Jimin shook his head. "She was the one teaching me something." "What?" Jungkook asked. Jimin looked back toward the house. "That people who seem strong often need someone to ask them if they're okay too." Suga stood nearby, listening quietly. He understood why Jimin had connected so deeply with Jungkook's mother. They both shared something similar. They noticed everyone else's pain before acknowledging their own. Before leaving, Suga turned toward Jungkook and said, "Don't let this moment become just an emotional memory." Jungkook looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Remember the lesson, not just the tears." Suga's words were simple, but they carried meaning. "The important part isn't that you found out about the secret. The important part is what you do now that you know." Jungkook nodded slowly. That afternoon, when they returned to the studio, something subtle changed among the members. Nobody mentioned the night in detail. They respected the privacy of what had happened, but they noticed small differences in Jungkook. He laughed a little more freely. He took breaks without feeling guilty. He answered his mother's calls without rushing. He asked others how they were and actually waited for the answer. RM noticed it first during a recording session. Jungkook had stopped midway through a song and suggested taking a short break because one of the staff members looked exhausted. It was something Jungkook had done before, but this time there was a different awareness behind it. He wasn't trying to save everyone. He was simply caring while also taking care of himself. Jin noticed another change during dinner. Jungkook was usually the first person to ask others if they needed anything, but that evening when Jin offered him food, Jungkook accepted without saying, "I'm fine." It was a small thing, almost unnoticeable. But to the members who had known him for years, it meant everything. J-Hope later joked that Jungkook had finally learned how to let people spoil him sometimes. Everyone laughed, and even Jungkook admitted they were right. Meanwhile, Jimin and Suga continued visiting Jungkook's mother occasionally, but the nature of those visits changed. They were no longer secret meetings. They became ordinary conversations between people who had developed genuine respect for each other. They talked about music, life, memories, and the challenges that came with constantly moving forward. One evening, Jimin asked her why she had trusted him with such a personal part of her life. She smiled and answered, "Because you understand something many people forget." "What is that?" Jimin asked. "That every person has a story happening behind the smile they show the world." Those words stayed with him. They influenced the way he viewed not only his own life but also the people around him. Months later, when fans noticed small changes in BTS members' interactions, many wondered what had happened behind the scenes. They saw more moments of patience, more moments of support, more moments where the members seemed to understand each other without needing words. Of course, the public never knew the entire story behind those changes. They only saw small pieces: a smile during an interview, a hand placed on someone's shoulder, a moment of encouragement backstage. But those small moments carried the echo of a night when a hidden truth finally came into the light. The biggest change was not that Jungkook discovered his mother's secret. The biggest change was that everyone involved learned something about love. Jimin learned that protecting someone did not always mean keeping a promise of silence forever. Suga learned that sometimes the strongest support was simply being present when emotions became overwhelming. Jungkook learned that accepting help did not make him weaker, and his mother learned that the child she spent years protecting had grown into someone capable of standing beside her, not because he felt obligated, but because he truly wanted to. Yet even after everything changed, one question remained in the hearts of everyone who knew the story. How many people around us are silently carrying something heavy, waiting for someone to simply notice? Because sometimes the greatest act of kindness is not solving someone's entire life. Sometimes it is just being the person who sees them when everyone else is looking away. Months passed after that night, But the quiet transformation that began inside that small living room continued to spread in ways nobody could have predicted. There was no dramatic announcement, no public explanation, and no moment where the world suddenly understood what had happened. The most meaningful changes often happened away from cameras, away from headlines, and away from the expectations of millions of people watching from a distance. For Jungkook, the memory of that evening remained one of the most important moments of his life, not because he discovered a hidden secret, but because he finally understood a truth about the people who loved him. He had spent years believing that his role was to protect everyone around him. His members, his family, the people who supported him, and even strangers who looked up to him. But that night taught him that love was never meant to be a one-way responsibility. Sometimes the people we think we need to protect are the same people who have been protecting us all along. The small bracelet his mother gave him became something he wore more often, not as a public symbol or something for others to notice, but as a private reminder whenever he felt overwhelmed. Every time he looked at the simple words stitched inside it, he remembered that strength did not come from carrying everything alone. It came from understanding when to allow others to walk beside him. His relationship with his mother also changed in small but meaningful ways. Their conversations became longer. Their phone calls became less rushed. Instead of only asking, "Are you eating well?" or "Are you sleeping enough?" they began sharing more about their feelings, their worries, and even their fears. Jungkook started asking questions he had never asked before, not because he wanted to discover more secrets, but because he wanted to understand the person behind the role of mother. He realized that parents also had dreams, doubts, and moments when they needed reassurance. One evening, while having dinner together, Jungkook noticed his mother smiling while looking through old photographs. He asked what she was thinking about. She answered, "I was remembering the time when you were young and you thought you could become anything." Jungkook smiled. "And now," she looked at him warmly, "now I think you became something even better. You became someone who still cares." That simple sentence stayed with him. In the months that followed, Jungkook quietly became more intentional with the people around him. He spent more time talking with staff members after schedules ended. He checked on dancers, musicians, and workers who were often forgotten once the spotlight moved away. But there was one difference. Before, he did these things because he felt responsible for everyone. Now, he did them because he genuinely wanted to connect with people. Jimin noticed the change more than anyone. During a late-night recording session, the two sat together in the studio after everyone else had left. The room was dim, with only the glow from the computer screens illuminating their faces. Jimin looked at Jungkook and smiled. "You seem different." Jungkook laughed softly. "Different in a good way." "In a peaceful way," Jimin answered. "Before, you always looked like you were running towards something. Now it feels like you know why you're running." Jungkook thought about that for a moment. "Maybe because I finally understand that I don't have to prove I care, I just have to show it." Jimin nodded. He understood those words deeply, because he had learned something similar from Jungkook's mother. Kindness did not need an audience. It did not need recognition. It simply needed sincerity. Suga also carried the memory of that night differently. He rarely talked about emotional moments publicly, but those who knew him noticed a subtle change. He became even more attentive to the people around him. During rehearsals, he noticed when someone was unusually quiet. During meetings, he paid attention to the staff members who rarely spoke. He understood that many people carried invisible struggles, and sometimes a simple question like, "Are you okay?" could mean more than people realized. One night, while the members were sitting together after practice, Suga looked around the room and said something that surprised everyone. "We always talk about making people happy through music. But maybe the most important thing is remembering that everyone involved in making that music is also human." Nobody responded immediately because the truth of those words was powerful. They all understood what he meant. Behind every performance were countless unseen people. Behind every smile were personal stories. Behind every person was a world nobody fully knew. The story of Jungkook's mother also continued in a quiet way. She never became someone who sought attention for the things she had done. She continued helping people privately, just as she always had. But now, she allowed others to stand beside her. She no longer believed that asking for support meant becoming a burden. She learned that even those who spend their lives giving kindness deserve to receive it too. Some of the people she had helped over the years eventually reached important milestones in their own lives. The young musician from the photograph continued creating music. A child who once received support from her grew up and started helping others. A struggling family who once thought they had lost everything slowly rebuilt their lives. None of these stories became famous. None appeared in major headlines. But each one represented something meaningful. The idea that one person's compassion could continue moving forward long after the original moment had passed. Among fans, there was also a noticeable change. They did not know every detail of what happened, and they never needed to. They simply noticed moments of warmth between the members. They noticed how often they looked after each other, how naturally they offered support, and how comfortable they seemed showing vulnerability. Many fans reflected on their own lives and relationships. Some shared stories about calling their parents after years of avoiding difficult conversations. Others talked about reaching out to friends they had lost contact with. A small moment inside one family's home had quietly inspired many others to look at their own connections differently. That became the true legacy of the night. Not the secret, not the tears, not the emotional revelation. The legacy was the reminder that everyone has unseen battles and unseen acts of love surrounding them. Sometimes we only discover them when we finally stop moving long enough to look. Years later, when Jungkook thought back to that evening, he no longer remembered the pain of learning that something had been hidden from him. Instead, he remembered the warmth of being surrounded by people who cared enough to protect his heart. He remembered Jimin's patience, Suga's quiet understanding, his members standing together without judgment, and his mother's hand holding his when he finally allowed himself to be vulnerable. The house where the conversation happened remained ordinary. The furniture stayed the same. The walls held the same photographs. The neighborhood continued its normal rhythm. But for everyone who was there, that place became a symbol of something much bigger. A reminder that some of life's most powerful moments do not happen on stages filled with lights. They happen in quiet rooms, between honest conversations, when people finally stop pretending they are stronger than they feel. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson left behind from that night. The people who make the world brighter for others are often the ones who need someone to remind them that they deserve light too. Years after that unforgettable night, the memory remained not as a story about a hidden secret, but as a reminder of the quiet connections that shape human lives. The world often remembers the biggest moments, the performances, the awards, the achievements, and the celebrations seen by millions of eyes. But there are other moments that never become headlines, moments that happen behind closed doors and quietly change the people involved forever. For Jungkook, that night inside his family's home became one of those moments. It was the night he discovered that love was not always expressed through words spoken loudly or gestures designed to be seen. Sometimes love existed in the choices people made when nobody was watching. In every unanswered question, every quiet visit, every sacrifice made without expecting recognition. Looking back, Jungkook realized the truth had never been about why Jimin visited his mother in secret. It was about understanding why someone would carry a responsibility that was never theirs to carry. Jimin did not visit that house because he wanted appreciation. Suga did not keep the secret because he wanted to be seen as someone trustworthy. They did it because they understood something simple but powerful. When someone you care about is struggling, sometimes being present is the greatest gift you can offer. The experience also changed the way Jimin viewed the people around him. Before that night, he had always believed kindness was about noticing the small things, the tired staff member, the nervous performer, the fan who needed encouragement. But Jungkook's mother taught him something deeper. Kindness was not only about seeing someone else's pain, it was also about allowing others to see your own. For someone who spent years comforting others, that lesson was difficult to accept, but it became a part of him. He learned that even people who bring warmth into other people's lives sometimes need a place where they can rest. Suga carried a different understanding from the experience. He had always been someone who valued actions more than words. He believed that loyalty was proven through consistency, through staying when things became difficult. But that night reminded him that protecting someone did not always mean standing silently in the background. Sometimes protection meant having the courage to speak when the time was right. Sometimes it meant helping someone face a truth they were not prepared to hear. The members of BTS also carried their own reflections from what happened. RM often thought about how easily people hide their struggles while continuing to support others. Jin became even more intentional about creating moments where everyone could relax and feel cared for. J-Hope continued bringing energy and comfort to those around him, but he also became better at recognizing when someone needed quiet support instead of encouragement. V often reminded everyone that simple conversations could become the memories people hold onto forever. Each of them took something different from the experience, but the message was the same. No one should have to carry everything alone. The story also changed Jungkook's understanding of family. For years, he had viewed family as the people who supported him from the beginning, the people who watched him grow, encouraged his dreams, and celebrated his success. But he later understood that family was not only about who protected him when he was young. Family was also about who allowed him to be human when the world expected him to be perfect. His mother had spent years watching him become someone admired by millions. Yet inside that small house, she never saw a global artist or someone standing under bright lights. She only saw her son, the child who once held her hand, the young dreamer who wanted to make people smile, the person who sometimes needed to hear that he was already enough. That realization stayed with him, because fame could change many things, but it could never replace the simple comfort of being understood by someone who knew you before the world knew your name. Perhaps the most meaningful part of the story was not what happened between famous people. It was the reminder that every person carries a hidden chapter. The person sitting beside you may be fighting a battle you cannot see. The person who always offers support may secretly need support themselves. The person who smiles the most may be carrying questions they have never shared. And sometimes, the difference between someone giving up and continuing forward is one person who chooses to notice. The lesson from that night was not that everyone must solve other people's problems. It was not that we must carry every burden placed in front of us. Instead, it was about something much more realistic and human. Listen when someone speaks. Notice when someone becomes quieter than usual. Ask questions without expecting perfect answers. Give people space to be vulnerable, because compassion is not always found in extraordinary actions. Sometimes it is found in ordinary moments. A phone call that lasts longer than expected, a meal shared together, a simple message saying, "I'm here if you need me." In the years that followed, Jungkook occasionally returned to the same living room where everything changed. Sometimes he would sit quietly with his mother, drinking tea and looking at the old photographs on the wall. The notebook that once held hidden stories remained there, but now it was no longer kept away. It became part of the family's memories. A symbol of the lives touched by one person's quiet kindness. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset through the window, Jungkook asked his mother a question he had never asked before. "Do you regret not telling me sooner?" She smiled gently. After a moment of thought, she answered, "No, but I do regret that you thought you had to carry everything alone." Jungkook looked at her and smiled. "I think I understand now." And maybe that was the real ending to the story, not a dramatic revelation. Not a perfect resolution where every difficulty disappeared. Life never works that way. There would still be challenges, pressure, uncertainty, and moments when people struggled. But they would face those moments differently, with more honesty, with more patience, with the understanding that asking for help was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign of trust. The story of Jimin's quiet visits, Suga's silent support, and Jungkook's emotional discovery became a reminder of something timeless. The greatest impact we leave behind is not always measured by how many people know our name. It is measured by how many people feel less alone because we were there. And maybe somewhere in a quiet room, far away from the lights and the noise, Someone is waiting for the same thing everyone in this story eventually found. Not someone to fix everything, but someone willing to sit beside them and say, "You don't have to face this alone." But the meaning of that night did not end when the conversation ended. In many ways, it was only the beginning of a different way of seeing the people around them. The days continued to move forward, schedules became busy again, music filled the studios, and stages once again became places where thousands of lights surrounded them. From the outside, everything looked normal. The world continued to see performances, interviews, and moments of celebration. But for the people who had been inside that quiet house, something fundamental had changed. They no longer looked at each other only through the roles they carried. They saw the person behind the role. They saw the tired moments hidden behind smiles, the worries hidden behind confidence, and the emotions hidden behind words that were never spoken. For Jungkook, that understanding became something he carried into every part of his life. There were still days when pressure felt overwhelming. There were still moments when expectations felt heavier than he wanted to admit. But whenever those feelings returned, he remembered the conversation with his mother. He remembered that strength was not about pretending everything was easy. Strength was about having enough courage to say when something was difficult. He remembered the words that changed his perspective forever. Nobody should have to prove they deserve love by suffering silently. That lesson affected the way he treated others. During rehearsals, he became more aware of the small signs people often ignored. The staff member who became unusually quiet, the dancer who smiled but looked exhausted, the musician who stayed behind after everyone had left. He learned that sometimes people did not ask for help because they did not know how to ask. Sometimes they were simply waiting for someone to notice. One evening after a long practice session, Jungkook saw a young backup performer sitting alone in the corner of the studio. The room was almost empty, with only the sound of cleaning equipment in the hallway. Instead of walking past like he normally would when exhausted, Jungkook sat beside him. "Long day?" he asked. The performer smiled politely and said, "I'm okay." In the past, Jungkook might have accepted that answer immediately. But now he understood that "I'm okay" did not always mean someone was truly okay. He smiled and replied, "You don't have to be okay all the time." The young performer looked surprised. It was a simple sentence, but sometimes simple sentences arrived at exactly the right moment. Years later, that performer would remember those words, not because they solved every problem, but because they reminded him that someone had seen him. That was the kind of legacy created by quiet kindness. It did not always create dramatic changes overnight. Sometimes it simply planted a small idea inside someone's heart, an idea that they mattered, that their struggles were real, that they were not invisible. Jimin also carried the memory of that house differently as time passed. He often thought about Jungkook's mother and the way she had spent years helping others without expecting anyone to know. It made him reflect on the meaning of generosity. Many people believed kindness was something given from a position of strength, but he realized true kindness often came from people who understood hardship themselves. People who knew what it felt like to struggle were sometimes the ones who noticed suffering the fastest. During a quiet moment in the studio, Jimin once told Suga, "I think the world has many people who want to be kind, but sometimes they forget to slow down enough to see who needs kindness." Suga nodded. "Because everyone is busy fighting their own battles." Jimin looked at him and smiled slightly. "Exactly. That's why noticing someone matters." Those conversations stayed between them, but the impact appeared in their actions. They became more intentional about checking on the people around them, not because they wanted recognition, not because they wanted anyone to know, simply because they understood the value of being present. The most beautiful part was that none of them considered themselves heroes. Jimin did not see himself as someone who saved a family. Suga did not see himself as someone who carried an important secret. Jungkook's mother did not see herself as someone who changed lives. They were simply people making small choices based on care and understanding. And sometimes, small choices are the ones that create the biggest changes. The story also left a quiet message for everyone who heard it. In a world where people often measure success through numbers, achievements, and recognition, there are invisible forms of success that matter just as much. being the person someone trusts during a difficult moment, being the reason someone decides not to give up, being the voice that reminds another person they are not alone. Those moments may never appear in front of cameras, but they become part of someone's life forever. Perhaps that was why the memory of that rainy night remained so powerful, not because it involved famous names or unexpected revelations, but because beneath everything, it was simply a story about people. A son who finally understood his mother's heart. A mother who learned she did not have to carry everything alone. Friends who protected each other through silence and honesty. And a reminder that behind every person we admire, every person we meet, and every person we pass by, there is a story we may never know. So the question remains, how many people around us are silently waiting for someone to notice them? How many conversations have we avoided because we were too busy? How many people have smiled in front of us while carrying something heavy inside? Maybe we will never know every answer, but perhaps we do not need to know everything to make a difference. Sometimes all it takes is a moment of attention, a moment of patience, a moment where we choose to look beyond what is visible. Because in the end, the greatest memories are not always created by the moments when the whole world is watching. They are created in the quiet moments when one person chooses to care for another. And sometimes, that one choice is enough to change everything. The years continued to pass, but the lesson from that night remained quietly alive in the choices they made every day. It was never a story that needed to be repeated loudly, because its meaning was already found in the way people changed afterward. Some stories do not need millions of people to hear them to become meaningful. Some stories become powerful because they transform the hearts of the few people who experience them directly. For Jungkook, the most important discovery was not learning that his mother had helped someone behind his back. The most important discovery was realizing how deeply he had been loved even during the moments when he felt the most alone. He had spent years standing in front of crowds, hearing people say his name, receiving endless support from fans around the world. But inside that quiet home, he discovered a different kind of love. A love that existed before the fame, before the stages, before the achievements. A love that did not disappear when the lights turned off. A love that simply said, "You are still my child, no matter how many people know your name." That realization changed the way he looked at his own journey. He began to understand that success was not only about reaching the highest point. It was also about remembering the people who stood beside him before he arrived there. The people who believed in him when there was nothing to prove. The people who saw his potential when he only saw uncertainty. The people who supported him not because he was successful, but because he was himself. Jimin often thought about how different that night could have been. A misunderstanding could have grown into resentment. A secret could have become a wound instead of a bridge. But because everyone involved approached the situation with honesty and compassion, something painful became something healing. It reminded him that relationships were not defined by moments when everything was perfect. They were defined by how people handled difficult moments together. There were no perfect answers that night. Jimin had struggled with whether keeping the promise was the right decision. Jungkook had struggled with feeling excluded from something important. His mother had struggled with wanting to protect her son while also needing support herself. Suga had struggled with knowing when silence was helpful and when truth needed to be spoken. But despite all those uncertainties, they chose understanding over judgment. And perhaps that was the reason the moment became unforgettable. Because real human connections are not built when people never make mistakes. They are built when people are willing to understand each other's intentions. Suga, who had always been known among those close to him as someone who carefully observed situations before speaking, carried the memory of that night as a reminder of the importance of emotional honesty. He knew that many people hide their pain because they do not want to become a burden. He understood that feeling because he had seen it in himself and in others. The experience with Jungkook's family showed him that sometimes the people who appear the strongest are often the ones who have learned to hide their struggles the best. From that point forward, he paid closer attention to the moments between conversations, the pauses before someone answered, the smiles that seemed slightly forced, the silence that lasted longer than usual. He knew that sometimes the things people did not say were just as important as the words they spoke. The members continued moving forward with their own challenges, but they carried a stronger understanding of each other. They no longer saw support as something that only appeared during difficult situations. They saw it as something built through everyday actions. A meal shared after a long day, a message sent just to check in, a moment of laughter when someone needed relief, a quiet presence when words were not enough. Those small actions became their own language. A language that did not need explanation because everyone understood its meaning. And perhaps that was the greatest gift left behind by the night at Jungkook's family home. It reminded everyone involved that people are not only the roles they show to the world. A singer is not only a singer. A performer is not only a performer. A mother is not only a mother. A friend is not only the person who appears during happy moments. Every person carries countless layers of memories, fears, dreams, and hopes that others may never see. The challenge is remembering that those hidden layers exist. The challenge is choosing kindness even when we do not know the entire story. Because every day, people around us are fighting invisible battles. Some are afraid to ask for help. Some are waiting for permission to be honest. Some are simply hoping someone will notice that they are trying their best. And sometimes, the smallest act of understanding can become the moment they remember for the rest of their lives. A conversation, a visit, a hand placed on someone's shoulder, a simple sentence saying, "I am here." Looking back, Jungkook realized that the secret his mother kept was never really about hiding something from him. It was about teaching him something he needed to learn at the right time, that love cannot always be measured by how much we do for others. Sometimes love is also measured by how willing we are to receive care from the people who love us. For someone who spent so many years trying to become strong for everyone else, learning how to accept support became one of the greatest forms of growth. The small house where everything happened remained ordinary. There were no signs outside telling people that something important had occurred there. No cameras captured the conversations. No audience witnessed the tears. But perhaps that was exactly why the memory remained so special. It belonged only to the people who were there. It was a reminder that the most valuable moments in life are often not the ones the world celebrates. They are the quiet moments when people choose honesty over pride, compassion over misunderstanding, and connection over distance. And maybe, somewhere in another home, another family is having a conversation they have been avoiding for years. Maybe someone is gathering the courage to say what they truly feel. Maybe someone is waiting for another person to notice their silent struggle. The story of Jimin, Suga, and Jungkook's family leaves behind a simple question that belongs not only to them, but to all of us. When someone we care about is quietly carrying a burden, will we be the person who walks past them, or the person who chooses to sit beside them? Because sometimes, one moment of kindness does not just change a single day. Sometimes, it becomes the reason someone believes tomorrow can still be better.